mentioned, my name is Samantha Pierce. I'm the Vice President of Sustainability. Also joined on this presentation with Christy Witcher, the VP of the Design, Construction, and Environmental Unit. So today, we're going to continue our training series on the newly released Sustainability Guidelines, specifically today covering new construction. And for this training, we're going to do what we're calling our deep dive into the content of the booklet, while also hopefully orienting yourselves with the structure of the Sustainability Design Guidelines. So a refresher to anyone that joined on our first meeting, which was held last week, which was an overview of the general structure of both the existing building and new construction guidelines. If anyone has not already previewed the booklet, either new construction or existing building, please check out our sustainability landing page, which you can see here on the screen. Super easy to access. You just scroll down and select the Sustainability Guidelines block, which is about halfway down the page, shown on the left-hand side of your screen here. You'd click into the Sustainability Guidelines and then choose the appropriate booklet that you would like to download so that you can review the booklet either along with us as we go through it or afterwards if you've not already downloaded the material for yourselves. So again, just a really quick reframe for those folks that maybe did not join us on the first call. The Sustainability Guidelines are structured in 3 sections. Our first section is a list of third-party core sustainability requirements. We'll get into what those are for new construction. Our section 2 is more of a prescriptive system-by-system or compliance requirement that lists out different sections like HVAC, lighting, water, etc. And our section 3 are some additional criteria that we think are important to building healthy, sustainable homes for our affordable housing communities in New York State. And this captures areas like indoor air quality, solar, and resiliency, just to name a few. In addition to the general overview of the booklet, I did just want to remind folks, and I apologize for not mentioning this, that we do want to take most verbal questions at the end of the session. So if anyone does have a question while I'm reviewing or Christy is reviewing some of the content, please do feel to pop that question in the chat. As I mentioned, Kathleen is supporting our work here today, and Kathleen will be monitoring the chat. If there's something that is an important point to make at that exact moment, Kathleen will go ahead and raise that for either Christy or myself. So again, please do utilize the chat feature on the WebEx if you do have a question while we're reviewing anything. Otherwise, we're hoping to leave a decent amount of time at the end of the presentation for a live Q&A, as well as address any questions that come up during the presentation itself. Thank you for that reminder to mention that, and apologies. Okay, so these are the 3 sections of our new construction booklet that we're going to go over. The first section I'm going to turn over to Christy to review.
Okay, great. Thanks, Samantha. So let's go to the next slide. All right. For those of you that are able to join us in the first overview presentation of the Sustainability Guidelines, this is a little bit of a repeat of what we went over then, but in section 1 of the guidelines, there are 2 core sustainability requirements. The first is that projects must be all electric, and that is they may not utilize any fossil fuel sourced equipment or appliances. So this includes all heating and cooling equipment, domestic hot waters, cooking appliances, and clothes dryers. So since the HCR Design Guidelines had already required all electric cooking appliances and dryers in the 2021 Design Guidelines, the biggest change here is really mandating all electric heating and cooling equipment in new construction. The second requirement is that all projects certify with a third-party standard that encompasses some sort of sustainability and energy requirements. So many of these had already been offered as an option under the required mandatory energy efficiency strategy or green bond certification in the current Appendix F of the 2021 Design Guidelines. And one notable change from the previous requirements is that we opened it up to allow WELL of FitWell certification. Next slide. There are a few allowable exceptions to the 2 core sustainability requirements that I just reviewed. The first is that projects that are located in an area where the grid cannot meet the demand of the new all-electric building, a waiver is acceptable given the applicant provide an electric load letter from the grid demonstrating that there's insufficient electrical service to construct the all-electric building. And the second exception is for the use of on-site emergency backup power generation. And this is really aligning with the NYSERDA new construction housing program, but fossil fuel-based generators are permitted. We'll just ask that a letter be provided stating that on-site generators will only be used in tests and emergencies when there's a power failure. Next slide. There are a few stretch goals that projects may pursue in Section 1, and to achieve a stretch goal, those projects must still meet the all-electric requirement, but in lieu of one of the third-party standards that we already discussed, projects may pursue one of the 3 following stretch standards, and that's LEED V4.1 BD and C 0, 2020 Enterprise Green Communities Plus, or Passive House. Next slide. Now, this again is a bit of an overview that we provided last week, but in the new construction guidelines, if a project chooses to pursue a stretch goal in Section 1, they're automatically deemed to be in compliance with Section 2 and can completely skip the requirements of that section and move on to Section 3. And the intent with this optional stretch pathway is really to provide a simpler means of compliance for projects that are pursuing the third-party standards. For projects that choose to comply with the baseline only, you can move on to Section 2, building performance requirements. And with that, I'll hand this back to Samantha to give you an overview of the Section 2 requirements. I think you're on mute, Samantha.
Thanks. Sorry, navigating the slide change and my mute button is challenging there. So moving on to Section 2, and again, just reinforcing, as Christy mentioned, if you've chosen to complete a stretch goal from Section 1, you'd skip this section. So this section is applicable for all projects that choose a baseline standard in Section 1. So as we laid out in the top of the presentation, each section in Section 2 is by category. So we'll start with appliances. So for appliances, this is pretty straightforward and aligns with our previous design guidelines Appendix F, where we're requiring Energy Star or CEE Tier 1 and that all appliances be all electric. With a stretch goal reaching towards some of the more efficient appliance ratings that you see here, CEE Tiers 2, 3, or 4. Next section is lighting. Lighting or baseline requirement is that all electric fixtures be Energy Star LEED or equivalent, and that any exterior fixtures be certified to dark sky approved or equivalent. This is to mitigate light pollution, and that you install controls to limit the daytime hours that exterior lights are running. And for stretch goals, we're asking developers to reach towards really maximizing daylight, both inside and outside, utilizing sensor technology to minimize glare and to help deal with heat gain from light fixtures, as well as to look at common area occupancy sensors and bi-level lighting, as well as photovoltaic cells on exterior fixtures. I want to point out at this time as well that it's not required to only choose all baseline or all stretch goals, meaning the baseline is, of course, a required set of standards, but a project could choose to do one stretch goal and not the others. So it's not mandatory that you make the leap completely to all stretch goals listed, but rather you can choose one stretch goal or another while still complying with all baseline requirements at a minimum. If the stretch goal exceeds the baseline requirement, that would, of course, be considered in compliance with the baseline. For building envelope, For building envelope, we're looking for projects to be 15% more efficient than New York State code. This is also aligned in some ways with the New York State Energy Code. And for stretch goals, we're looking for a 30% more efficient envelope than New York State code. We can get into details on some later discussions around how and what tools we would find acceptable to show this, but typically you'd be working with an energy or engineer consultant that would be able to model these results and submit them to HCR. For our HVAC, heating and cooling section, and I'm just going to maybe kindly ask that if anyone is not muted, they mute themselves at this point. Thanks. Unless there's an urgent question from Kathleen. Apologies for that. Okay, so for our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or heating and cooling section, specifically here on the screen, our baseline requirement is that, as Christy outlined, that the heating appliances be all electric, but they also meet the following standards, that cold climate air source heat pumps be used and that have a COP of 3.5 or higher. Other eligible heating equipment would be ground source heat pumps, that they meet our technical requirements, which we've outlined in our document. So our technical standards, meaning the COP of 3.5 or higher. We have some other requirements for refrigerant lines in terms of 2-pipe or 3-pipe lines that I would refer your engineers to review before designing a project. As well as meet the design requirements. We are sensitive to the design and placement of the exterior units. So there's some information in the document providing guidance there. We're also requiring for a baseline that the controls for these units provide programmable thermostats, and that apartments have individual thermostats within them to allow for more unitized control and set points. And that as part of the installation of these units, that the team provides a proper commissioning plan to ensure the units are operational and the controls and thermostats work properly at the point of construction completion before tenant lease up. For stretch goals, we're asking teams to look at utilizing BACnet infrastructure to provide either central control or central monitoring capability to help mitigate maybe a thermostat being left on when the unit is unoccupied, perhaps during tenant turnover, that would provide the owner insight into the heating controls. So that would be one of the stretch goals that we have for the heating and cooling section. For domestic hot water, we're also again requiring that all electric appliance and that technically speaking, that we utilize either heat pump water heaters or subcentral electric hot water heaters, as well as or in-unit instant hot water heaters. So we're pretty open to the design decisions of your engineer team and have provided some guidance on these units in our document. For stretch goals, we are looking for solar thermal and or ground source heat pumps as a way to further reduce energy demand in the building. For ventilation, we are requiring for the baseline requirement that project teams follow the guidance of their third-party certification program. So there's no additional requirements outside of the chosen third-party requirement for ventilation. And we would ask that teams consider either ERV or HRV for stretch goals and really align with the passive house ventilation system there, or to look at passive ventilation strategies to minimize electric load for ventilation when possible. For water efficiency, this one is pretty straightforward and has not changed a ton from our Appendix F from our design guidelines from 2021. We are looking for and to ensure that we minimize water consumption on buildings, as well as looking to conserve energy. So we are, looking for toilets that are 1.28 gallons per flush, or that are dual flush with a not to exceed below 0.8 GPF on the low setting. And then for stretch goals, anything that's more efficient than the above baseline requirements, the project team is encouraged to explain that in their application or coordination with project managers. We'd also encourage project teams to explore gray water systems for non-potable uses or, other reusable uses. I will turn section 3 back over to Christy.
Great, thanks, Samantha. So section 3, the first set of requirements in this section relates to indoor environmental quality practices. 2 of these requirements, low VOC building materials and integrated pest management, are a carryover from the design guidelines that are now nested here in the sustainability guidelines. Low VOC building materials was updated to reference standards for materials that align more with the industry green building standards. So it would be important to reference these and update all specifications in projects to meet these standards. For integrated pest management, these requirements remain largely the same, but now we ask for a service contract to be provided as part of the project closeout binder. And one of the new additions to this booklet addresses protecting ventilation equipment and ductwork during construction. It includes measures to seal all ventilation during construction and flush the system prior to occupancy. And this requirement also aligns with some of the green building standards that many projects have already been pursuing. Next slide. The next set of requirements in section 3 relates to sustainable construction practices. So we are asking that all projects implement a construction waste plan that reduces non-hazardous construction and demolition waste through recycling, salvaging, or diversion strategies. This is a strategy that many of you in New York City are probably already complying with, and others may have been pursuing as part of the green building programs that you have chosen to certify with. And the stretch goal in this category really represents what many of these existing programs already require, with a target diversion of 75% from landfills and a max target for construction waste going to landfills. So this is one of the stretch goals that may quickly move to a baseline requirement in the future for HCR. So while the baseline requirement is now fairly loose, we do really encourage projects to take steps to begin reaching the stretch goals for this particular requirement. Next slide. This next set of requirements for section 3 relates to operations, and really that pertains to setting up the building for successful operations. These requirements include standards, our standard energy and water benchmarking requirement that's been implemented at the agency a few years ago. Requirements also include a number of documents needed at project closeout, including a building operations and maintenance manual, emergency management manual, a resident manual. And it also includes requirements for training and walkthroughs with all building staff and establishing a maintenance log for key building systems. Slide. Okay, moving on to site requirements for section 3. Most of these requirements really migrated over from the design guidelines. The first requirement is for level 2 EV chargers. And in line with the current requirement, projects should provide at least 1 EV charger for every 20 parking spaces. We included an additional requirement that was previously recommended to projects during design reviews, but we're now asking that all projects with driveways rather than parking lots include a dedicated branch circuit for EV charging receptacle adjacent to the driveway, so that anyone with an EV charging or an EV has the capability of charging their vehicle while they're parking in the driveway. So the stretch goals for this site section include increasing the number of EV chargers provided, in the project, and also including beneficial site amenities that promote resident health, such as raised planter beds for resident gardens or outdoor walking trails or fitness areas. Next slide. The next set of requirements in Section 3 relates to solar. And aligning with HPD requirements, we are now requiring all projects in New York City to comply with a solar feasibility study. And for projects outside of New York City, a solar feasibility study is a stretch goal. Another stretch goal in this section also includes utilizing solar-ready design to allow for future installation of solar PV, and designing the project with passive solar principles, such as orientation of the building and natural shading devices such as trees, or building integrated shading devices such as brise-soleils. Okay. And finally, HCR has taken steps to address resiliency as part of our sustainability requirements. These resiliency standards and stretch goals are really an attempt to address thoughts about where we locate projects, in addition to implementing mitigative measures for project resiliency during extreme weather events. The first baseline requirement under resiliency is that all projects must conduct a resiliency assessment. For projects that are pursuing enterprise green communities as their third-party standard, a resiliency assessment that's equivalent to the criteria listed in 1.6 Resilient Communities Multi-Hazard Vulnerability Assessment should be conducted. For projects that are not pursuing enterprise green communities, should utilize FEMA's National Risk Index map to identify any potential hazards. And for both of these, we're expecting a report and supporting narrative describing the steps the project will take to mitigate and identify risks if applicable. Okay. In addition to this, we are requiring that all projects that are senior housing projects and projects that are providing housing to persons with special needs in at least 50% of the dwelling units should incorporate measures that allow for those more vulnerable populations to shelter in place. These requirements include adequate backup power generation for elevators, potable water, and community rooms that provide basic functions such as power, heating and cooling, lighting, restrooms, refrigeration, and cooking appliances in the community room. Now, moving on to stretch requirements for resiliency. There are a number of stretch goals outlined in the document that we really encourage projects to pursue. These include minimizing potential effects of urban flooding through enhanced stormwater management and building design. An example of some of these would be no basement apartments, elevating mechanical equipment where applicable, and utilizing backwater control plugs. It would also include installing sump pumps in basements, special design consideration for projects located in the 500-year floodplain, active resiliency measures for all projects, such as the ones that we had reviewed under the requirements for senior and special needs housing. And finally, designing buildings to maximize passive survivability, such as designing a highly efficient building envelope that maximizes the number of hours that buildings stay within comfortable and survivable temperatures without heating or cooling equipment. And also utilizing natural ventilation and lighting in spaces to help make sure more spaces are usable or livable in the event of a power outage. Okay, so that wraps up the review of the new construction sustainability guidelines, and I'm now going to hand this back to Samantha to lead us into our Q&A and discussion section of this presentation.
Great, thank you, Christy. Hopefully folks found that a valuable, relatively quick overview of the document. I do just want to point out, and I realized something we failed to mention in the beginning, in case folks, again, we're not on that first training, this guideline, this set of guidelines, both the new construction, which we just reviewed today, and the existing building booklet are both available for your review and implementation into new projects that you might begin to start designing with yourselves or your development team. But They are not required for projects that already have scheduled closing dates before December 2022. So the intent here is that you are given time to prepare your projects, which are going to be submitted for application in the future, as well as projects that are at the very preliminary stages, perhaps in our 4% pipeline. So if you do not already have a scheduled closing date before December 2022, that might be referring to your project. So you should reach out to your project manager to discuss specifics. We are, of course, encouraging anybody, and this is specific for the 4% bond team deals that are not sure which way to go, that you comply with these guidelines as much as possible, but that the agency is switching over to these being required for any project closing on or after December 2022. So hopefully that's helpful as a reminder or new information to those that might not have been on our previous training.